social finance is not really a new phenomenon, and communities have always utilized capital to combat social, economic, or environmental crises.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. In this episode, we're going to talk about social finance and explore how organizations leverage it to help them further their missions. We have two guests on the show today to dive into this topic. Our first guest is Leena, Yahia, the research lead at a new study published by Imagine Canada, which presents 22 case studies of organizations leveraging social finance. This project was funded by the Government of Canada through the Investment Readiness Program, commonly called IRP, an initiative by Employment and Social Development of Canada to strengthen organizations to participate in the social finance marketplace. Our second guest is Rebecca Waterhouse, principal at Raven Indigenous Outcomes Fund, a first-of-its-kind global fund established at Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation. This charity, which is featured in the study, was established to research, develop, deploy, and evaluate outcomes finance tools in collaboration with Indigenous communities to address complex community-level issues. Leena and Rebecca, thank you for joining us on the podcast and welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Social finance is repayable investment that seeks to generate a positive social, environmental, and/or cultural impact. While we hear more about it now and it's gaining popularity, it's not a new concept. The origins of this type of financing are found at the grassroots level. It was created a long time ago by communities to finance community-driven initiatives. Social finance is an alternative to traditional finance models. While it might not be a panacea to solve all social problems, it has tremendous potential to propel organizations by offering a funding model that can help them ensure their long-term financial sustainability. Leena, I'll turn to you first. Can you provide a few examples of social finance repayable investment and how organizations can use repayable investment to help them achieve their mission?
Absolutely. Well, Bruce, like you said, social finance is not really a new phenomenon, and communities have always utilized capital to combat social, economic, or environmental crises. We've often seen different actors, especially at the grassroots level, surface to solve various problems and issues. These ways have taken different forms, and we've seen several examples throughout the 22 case studies that we've done. I think I will start with 10C. 10C is a hub based in Guelph, the Ontario region, for change makers. 10C wanted to access capital to purchase and redevelop a property that would be utilized as a community hub. And in their journey, they wanted to work with like-minded individuals and be aligned with the stakeholders they engaged with. And so they worked with different groups and organizations to develop community bonds and eventually raise approximately $2.3 million Canadian and successfully purchased 42 Carden Street, a building that they now own and that serves as a hub for increasing community engagement and partnerships. So that's one example of using community bonds to achieve mission. Another example is a more international one, which is IDE. IDE Canada is an international nonprofit, and it's dedicated to helping entrepreneurs end poverty. As some of us may know, women in emerging markets and other minorities face a lot of challenges accessing capital. They're often perceived to be more risky. And so traditional ways of financing present a lot of challenges for them. And they've been gatekept or deprived of opportunities to access capital and improve their circumstances. What IDE Canada does is that it provides micro loans at affordable rates, so with little or zero interests to these women and help them create their businesses and improve their livelihoods. Finally, another example that we saw, and this one was very interesting for me personally. Within Canada, we have 1.8 million Muslims that are often not financially included because of the lack of availability of faith-aligned finance options. So if you're a Muslim in Canada and you want to buy a home, there's very little to no faith-aligned loans. In Islam, interest, for example, is prohibited. And loans out there, the current ones, come with a share of interest. And so we've seen Abrahamic Finance, one of our participants, work with community partners to create faith-aligned loans to help people access capital in a way that's aligned with their faith, essentially to create more financial inclusion in Canada. Another organization that we've had the pleasure to work with is Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation, and they utilize outcomes-based finance to offer supportive funding tools to improve Indigenous lives. Rebecca Waterhouse, I had the pleasure of chatting with you throughout our research.
Yeah, thanks, Leena. At the Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation, we use outcomes-based financing to allow for communities to achieve improved health and wellness outcomes. And so we are propelled by many of different drivers to offer alternative financing methodologies for communities to enact the change they want to see in climate and health. Altogether, our model operates as such. We engage with an Indigenous community based on the need that is brought to us. We work with the community deeply to allow for the articulation of a theory of change. Within the business case, we'll then articulate the benefits in a rate card system. The rate card costs the value of the desired outcomes in monetary as well as in Indigenous values. Altogether, this allows for an articulation of cost savings as well as benefit to the responsible authority or interested outcomes purchaser, which is often the federal government or provincial government or that of a crown corporation. Propelled by a reconciliation framework, all tiers of government are being held accountable to the promises of achieving better outcomes for all Indigenous peoples. And so while the federal government holds statutory authority for Indigenous peoples, responsibility overlaps with provincial authorities across several jurisdictions. And so when we enter into a community-driven outcomes contract, based on the context of the work, for example, in climate or in on-reserve climate work, we will go to the federal government, for example, Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, a crown entity of the federal government, as well as the regional entity, of which is, for example, in Manitoba, Efficiency Manitoba, to discuss the purchasing of improved outcomes in that region. Federal Indigenous spending is growing faster than overall spending, and so it was about $25 billion in 2022, and it's projected to rise to about $36 billion between 2026 and 2027. So an increase of about 42%. This doesn't account for provincial or territorial projections. And critically, we know that long-term historical evidence on increased government spend suggests that it does not close the community well-being gap in living standards between First Nations and other Canadians. And this is as I was speaking to, this is a methodology, a process of engagement most importantly, that allows for government to meet those improved outcome targets. It allows for accountability. And so this is why their buy-in is, we're seeing a great deal of buy-in from a number of our federal, provincial, regional, municipal governments with this model.
It's so interesting. As someone who's worked in the sector for a long time, I know that there's often a tension between organizations wanting to launch innovative practices and having access to capital to do so. For organizations that are in an exclusively fundraising-based model, it's really hard to raise enough money to be able to try new things. And I think some of the examples that you've just shared are ways of thinking that are different than what we've seen in the past, and hopefully ones that we can see other organizations pick up on. So with that, we're going to turn to you now, Rebecca. Let's talk more specifically about your work at Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation.
It's really interesting and critical, to remind listeners that social finance is not a new concept. It's really sprung from this focus on need that is not being met by traditional finance. As traditional, as the namesake points out, is designed for a select few. It's meant to be exclusive, right? And so a lot of people, a lot of communities that represent Canada as we see it today have been excluded from the financial ecosystem and from the financial markets. And so the Raven Impact Indigenous Foundation is really there to address a specific Indigenous need for Indigenous-led and owned finance. And so we come through as an Indigenous intermediary, and we offer relationship capital to communities to explore the idea of financing impact narratives in a different and accessible way. And so what that means for us is looking at how a program is currently funded. And typically we focus in the realms of climate and health. And we say, how is this program being funded? What are the outcomes of it? And why is it not meeting the needs of communities at this point in time? And altogether, we work with communities through an Indigenous Solutions Lab process to outline and draft through a theory of change that allows them to articulate that vision for change. And altogether, we can then cost out what it will take to facilitate those interventions. And then we can look at the benefits that accrue because of those interventions. And so that's a very high level explanation. And so if we want to offer maybe a more anecdotal description, we can take the example of our work in Peguis and Fisher River First Nations in Manitoba. And so what we did with those communities, and based on the need that was brought to the Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation, was we decided to answer their call for improved methodologies to achieve energy sovereignty, energy efficiencies on reserve. And so the community really, really believed in the power of renewable energies and the alignment to their value system. And so there's a great deal of need also to see direct training and employment benefits. And so we were able to triangulate all of those needs together and say, by the installation of geothermal systems on reserve in community, we will allow for the training and hiring of local Indigenous peoples and communities to see money at work immediately. We will then see direct benefit from the training and from the labor and from the installs through Indigenous social enterprises that will be facilitating the work. And then we'll also be able to see the tertiary and subsequent benefits that come from that. So we're talking about GHG emission reductions. We're talking about immediate energy efficiencies that are gained from geothermal. And we're also talking about communal as well as health benefits that you'll see through improved living conditions, housing resiliency, etc. And so we offer the opportunity to package a desired state differently. This is a very common language that we're seeing across the board these days, looking for greater accountability and outcomes for taxpayers, for governments, for many jurisdictions. But we're trying to drive change, and we're trying to drive an Indigenous approach to that change and valuation system. And so at the foundation, what's most critical to us is that this change is driven by community need. It's driven through community design and co-ownership, and that all of the benefits actually reside and allow the community or sit with community and allow them to get to where they want to be on so many different levels.
So why do you believe this model is more effective than common current funding models to produce lasting change and impact in Indigenous communities?
So the fact that it is rooted in community need and desire, it allows for the operationalization to a much more effective degree, an efficient degree. And I guess what we'll draw the parallel to is typical grant funding or philanthropic funding, or that of contribution agreements, generally from the federal government or provincial governments who have statutory authority over the majority of Indigenous program spending. And so the community-driven outcomes contract model, a CDOC as we call it at Raven, allows for communities to take a look at how their programs are currently funded or not. And it allows for the identification or a gap analysis to occur. It then allows for subsequent mapping of their ecosystem assets that already exist. Further, it allows for the digging into the evidence base supporting effective interventions. There is then a connection that is made to the ultimate improved state and the methodologies that rest in Indigenous epistemology, tradition, and systems that can be connected. And so altogether, the resounding bundle of intervention or the actual packaging is very sound and concrete in that it is connected to scientific evidence. It's also connected to the latest market research. And most importantly, it's connected to Indigenous ways of being and living and seeing the world. And so there's this really difficult work that governments altogether have struggled to facilitate. There is a dearth of data as it relates to Indigenous programming and the effectiveness behind it because there is a lack of connection and relationships at the community level. And so that's what the foundation does. We say, altogether, we're living in a window of opportunity. And so this context or this window of opportunity is characterized by Indigenous resurgence in community development and wealth building activities, commitments surrounding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, especially as it relates to operationalizing UNDRIP, and legislated national and provincial Indigenous programming and procurement strategies, and also reinforced by the deployment of the Social Finance Fund. And so this model particularly is effective as it allows for government action to be met with true connection, representation, ownership on behalf of the Indigenous peoples that they aim to serve better. So when deployed in a really culturally safe and respectful manner, that is finance, this structure enables self-determination and of human services. And honestly, this is what communities have struggled with for a long time. And so we believe altogether that this model, this Indigenous social finance model, is really positioned to allow for communities to excel, to action the change that they want to see. I also want to point out that just in terms of data points, that in terms of population size, so Indigenous people are about 5% of the Canadian population. A Bloomberg study that occurred a few years ago at this point indicated that they were receiving only 0.7% of gifted funds. So not even proportional to their population size. Of that, you can understand then that where the need arises for not only for new types of funding, but for just plain old funding.
Thanks, Rebecca. And, it's just amazing to hear about the approach that's being taken here. I think both in the model that you're employing and utilizing, some of the examples that Leena provided, really sort of strikes me about a fundamentally different way of thinking about unlocking capital to solve kind of complex community-based or social issues. So really exciting to hear. This next question I'm going to pose to both of you, and I'm going to kick off with Leena. From your point of view, what are the biggest barriers organizations face when it comes to social finance? So Leena, over to you first, and then we'll come to you, Rebecca, on this question.
Sure. So from the research that we led, we can see that there is different barriers, some that exist at a system level and some exist at an organizational level. And if we're going to think about the biggest barriers that organizations face at the system level, I would say that the lack of availability of products and information is probably considered the biggest barrier. And thankfully, we're now seeing some changes with the launch of the Social Finance Fund. I was in a meeting this morning, for example, with the wholesalers discussing progress that's being made to co-create products that are aligned with the demand side. So what social purpose organizations in Canada need. And it's a very exciting time to see these developments. At the organizational level, I would say that among the biggest barriers are risk perception. This happens mostly on the side of leadership or the board, where they tend to sometimes be risk averse or have low risk appetite. As we know, nonprofit boards are directly involved in the decision making around finance, and there's implications around that. So I would say that's probably the biggest one at the organizational level.
Great. Thanks. Rebecca, same question to you in terms of barriers that organizations face.
Absolutely. I'll double down on what Leena has said. I think the ultimate barrier is your human capital. We know that those that have the reins or offer their time and energies to social sector organizations, social purpose organizations, whatever you want to call them, go above and beyond on the daily. And so the ability to, if you are not already kind of sat in the middle of the social finance kind of conversation based on the context of your work, you have to take the time on the side of your desk to look into, to build a relationship, to build your bench strength as it relates to social finance. And what do I mean by that? From the organizations of which I've had the pleasure of working with, I know that the investment readiness, the consideration of debt, which is the most common form of vehicle as it relates to social finance in Canada, is and can often be perceived as quite scary. But we also know, and data has shown us from the previous report that was done, our Charities Ready for Social Finance, that many do have term loans. Often you will find that a lot of those term loans are actually personal loans that the executive directors have pulled. So there is a great disparity between the entrepreneurship that's occurring in organizations and the readiness of the governance structure or the corporate structure to reinforce that personal leadership. I think that what I get excited, though, is that there are a great deal of products now available. There's a great deal of ecosystem development that's occurred in the past few years. This is a true telltale of that, is that we are now speaking more broadly, widely, and inclusively with different groups about the diversity, the ranges, the histories of social finance mechanisms. And so while it is a barrier to that readiness component and that risk aversity, it's really an opportunity to take stock and to build relationships.
Thanks to you both for the response on that one. So, Leena, we're going to come to you for a couple of questions here. The study that you've been working on includes great examples of how various organizations are using social finance. Can you give us an overview of some of the other initiatives included in the study?
Absolutely. So for anyone who's seen our report, you'll notice that there's a diversity of organizational types, there's a diversity of tools and needs, populations served, stages of investment readiness, and levels of awareness of social finance. I'll mention a few, Bruce. So, for example, one that fights predatory lending, for example, in BC, which is called BC Rent Bank, and they offer micro loans to people in need. Then we have Furniture Bank, and Furniture Bank is based out of Ontario, but has successfully created a national network to engage others fighting furniture poverty. And there is a lot of organizations engaged in enterprising activity, such as the Raw Carrot, which supports employs people with disabilities to make soup in church kitchens. So offers them decent and respectful employment. And that's the Raw Carrot. We have Hike Nova Scotia, which supports building hiking trails across Nova Scotia to reduce the dependence on traditional loans, for example. And then we have Soul Share, that's operating in energy consulting, which is an Indigenous consulting firm that uses a sliding pay scale to develop services and technical assistance for community. So there's a whole range of different actors, and there's plenty more in our report. But what you will see is that there is a diversity of organizational types, tools, and needs.
Such interesting examples. I'm sure we could spend an entire podcast on each one of them and learn a bit more. But Leena, I'm going to stay with you on this. As you were going through this study, Was there one thing that particularly stood out to you during your conversations with organizations? If there's like one sort of distinct thing that was a highlight for you?
I think one distinct finding is the role that consultants played in mobilizing knowledge and facilitating access to social finance. So we saw that many organizations don't necessarily have the knowledge or the capacity to access or tap into social finance. And many didn't have the resources to employ a full-time person that was knowledgeable in social finance. And so what many organizations did is that they worked with consultants that acted as knowledge mobilizers and helped with wayfinding, if you would, in terms of understanding and decoding this new way of accessing capital.
So, Rebecca, before we come back to you, one more question for Leena. In 2020, Imagine Canada published a report called Are Charities Ready for Social Finance? Investment Readiness in Canada's Charitable Sector. The report explored how charities were looking at social finance. And what we learned from this study was that the majority of charities had very low levels of awareness of social finance. In your view, what would be the first step to take for an organization to learn more about social finance and the options that are available to them?
I would say, like Rebecca mentioned previously, that, reaching out to others, there's plenty of folks now in the ecosystem that are using social finance as a strategic way to increase their organizational sustainability and resilience. So one way sector leaders who are interested in tapping in social finance can go about is maybe reach out to people that are doing similar work or have had similar needs, whether in the same focus area or not. But we're seeing different examples across the country. And another place that they can go to is the increasing number of hubs for information. We're working with partners such as the Canadian Economic Development Network to share information across the ecosystem. They themselves are working on developing a demand-side social finance information hub. And so there's different types of initiatives that are popping up across the country to facilitate knowledge mobilization, co-creation, and collaboration. So I would say maybe tap into one of these networks and don't be shy. Ask a lot of questions. The ecosystem is still in development. Everybody's learning. People are doing this and learning as they go. And so learning and reaching out, I would say, is a great first step for sector leaders.
And to your point, even in the 3 years since the initial study was released, it's amazing to see how much more information is now easily and readily available for organizations to take a look at. So as we wind up this episode, my last question is for both of you, and Rebecca, we'll start with you. What do social good leaders need to change if they want to be open to considering social finance tools for their organizations and be ready to leverage social finance to achieve their missions?
Well, I will say that I don't know if it's a matter of needing to change, but it's more a matter of intentionality. And so it's getting clear on your intentionality. Social finance is purpose-driven, much alongside it's reinforces the work that you do, your purpose-driven work already. And so there needs to be a North Star for engaging in that work. This work in our sector is critical and it's extremely time-consuming. It's based on us meeting a need. We have to serve a need. And so what is the purpose of social finance to your organization? Do you want to grow your revenues? Do you want to become more sustainable? Do you want to have greater impact? Do you want to see a new form of change as it relates to your lines of work? So allocating time and resources to those conversations, and then to the investigation, of what assets exist outside of your own kind of siloed organization, the relationships you have, the people on your team, your histories. It starts there. And I believe as you come to shift your understanding of what you have available and your perception of your assets, then you will have a much easier time delving into this nuanced space. And so, like Leena said, very exciting to see all of these wonderful community building resources that have been sprouting up across Canada. I would just call them hubs of information and now living in such an online world, we have access to a great deal of affordable and accessible expertise.
Thanks, Rebecca. So, Leena, same question. From your perspective, what might need to change for organizations to sort of lean into social finance?
I'm very happy to hear the alignment between Rebecca and myself. So I echo what Rebecca said around the need to articulate the value, maybe better articulate the value. And I think we probably need to do that as a sector, learn to articulate our value better and have a well-defined mission. And then there is the need to be more open to considering non-traditional ways for capital. So we know that traditional ways of philanthropic giving and donations and grants are on the decrease. They're continuously decreasing and changing. And so sector leaders and social good leaders need to be more open to considering non-traditional ways for accessing capital.
It's interesting how both of you have raised the fact that this is an area that has been around for a while and yet still at times feels quite emergent. And so thank you both to you, Rebecca and Leena, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to talk with us about social finance. It feels like this is an area that it would be great to revisit and explore again in the future, because I think for many leaders, they're just really dipping their toes in the water. So thanks again. I really appreciate your time and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. It's certainly exciting time, and I think it's exciting to see that social finance is not just a tool anymore, but many organizations are considering it as a strategic pathway for sustainability and increasing organizational resilience. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. I hope this is one of many conversations to continue. We're on a great trajectory. We're living in a great moment of time as it relates to social finance. And all I have to say to our listeners is be part of the journey. It's a great deal of work, but it is extremely rewarding.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.